Black Etc. podcast, a podcast about how ideas and culture spread among Black Americans, especially outside mass media. I'm your host, Ian Youssef. Today my guest is Dr. Paulette Richards, who's an artist in multiple media and disciplines. She's a scholar and a writer. She's written a book, Object Performance in the Black Atlantic, the United States. Her artistic and scholarly focus is generally Black puppetry and object performance in the African diaspora. We had a great, extensive discussion about the history of Black puppetry and the connection and cultural and historical traditions in Western Africa. Dr. Richards explained the gap in the material historical record where they have not found many Black puppets from enslaved Black Americans. And we go into the reasons why these things would have been forbidden and how African Americans here would have to find other ways to express that impulse to perform objects. So that got us to a discussion about how if we have not found many African American puppets during the time of enslavement, what do we find in Black America in terms of Black object performance? And we got to talking about Black folks animating church fans that have the faces of Black figures on them in a way that mimics performance or movement like humans, right? So we talked about MLK fans, Mahalia Jackson, and other Black figures printed on church fans, and how Black folks in those services sway and use them in stylized and in some ways ritualized manners in ways that mirror, as Dr. Richards argues, ceremonial rituals in Africa. There's also the idea of Black musicians in America making their instruments move like animated figures and sound like people. So several weeks ago, in my discussion with Lamont Jack Pearley, I mentioned my favorite blues song by my favorite blues artist, Charlie Patton, which is Mississippi Ball Weevil. And that one, the guitar sounds like him. And like a lot of Delta blues players and blues players in general have that bent note thing that makes it sound like the singer's voice. I think about my favorite jazz artist, Charles Mingus, and the way he writes horns. And often he has horns sound like they're wailing, sounds like they're laughing sometimes. The Black Saint and the Center Lady is an amazing album. It's all over that. And we also talked about the history of formal Black puppetry and puppeteers, from the Federal Theater Project, from the WPA, down through the many Black puppeteers and artists who worked on Sesame Street and other places, all the way through the modern time. So when I first came across Dr. Richards' work, I started thinking about examples of Black puppetry that I knew in pop culture. That is Willie Tyler and Lester, the Ventriloquist Act, Roosevelt Franklin on Sesame Street back in the day with Matt Robinson doing that. In the 90s and 2000s, there's the Nike commercials for Little Penny, which is Penny Hardaway's puppet voiced by Chris Rock. There was also the Kobe and LeBron puppets voiced by Kenan Thompson and David Alan Grier, so those commercials. There was the movie Tales from the Hood. They had a segment called KKK Comeuppance in one of its stories where the Black dolls came to life to get revenge on a racist politician who was inhabiting an old plantation house. Late 90s, there was Come On Feet, the Quasimodo/Madlib video. That's not depicting a Black person, it's depicting bugs and animals, but the artist is Black. And I'm happy that Dr. Richards introduced me to a lot of the modern examples of Black puppetry that I didn't even know. So this was an extremely fascinating and surprising discussion. Dr. Richards just opened up my mind. I have never researched or read about object performance, period, let alone in the African diaspora. I'm really grateful that I was able to speak to her about this. Without further ado, please enjoy. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Paulette Richards. She's a scholar, writer, multidisciplinary artist whose focus is the meaning of puppets, masks, and other performing objects in the African diaspora. She's taught workshops on the history of African American puppetry through the Chicago International Puppet Theater Festival, and has served as an adjunct professor in the Puppet Arts Certificate Program at the University of Connecticut. She's a co-curator with Dr. John Bell of the Living Objects African American Puppetry exhibit at the University of Connecticut's Ballard Institute and Museum, and she's created a traveling exhibit on the Wonderland Puppet Theater. Her book is Object Performance in the Black Atlantic, the United States. So a lot of accolades there. Welcome, Dr. Richards. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me, Ian. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So you have become well known for Black puppetry, but puppetry is just one example of a broader category you explore in your writing, which is object performance.
Yes.
Can you briefly define the general concept of object performance?
Okay, yes. So human beings across all cultures and historical periods have animated objects in performances, but not all of those performances follow a form of what we would consider to be a puppet show today. So the concept of object performance includes performances with things like masks, mahots. If you've seen a jester with a staff that has a jester head, that's the mahot. Mm-hmm. African dance staves, and you may have seen some of those. Once again, it's a staff with a carving, usually of a figure on the head, and some statues that have ritual significance, and even some dolls.
Do you mind me asking how you came to make this your scholarly and life work?
Sure. So I am a doll freak. I have always loved dolls. I also got into videography. And then, of course, I wanted my dolls to come to life on screen. So I started making video with my dolls, mostly Barbie and G.I. Joe, and quickly realized I was going to get into trouble with Mattel and Hasbro for using their trademarked characters. So I thought I should make some of my own figures. And when I had done that, I realized, oh, what you're doing is puppetry. You need to learn about puppets. Fortunately, I live in Atlanta. We have the Center for Puppetry Arts here, which is probably the largest nonprofit dedicated to puppetry in the country. It has 2 theaters, a museum, and classrooms where they hold puppet building workshops. So I started volunteering over there as a docent in the museum, and then things snowballed from there.
You've already given a couple examples, but can you give some more examples about how particular objects we don't view as related to puppets can serve that role in certain realms of Black culture? So, we've spoken before about like instruments and church fans. If you could just give me a couple examples and explain how that works.
Sure. So when I was first working on the Living Object exhibit, we were trying to trace the history of African American puppetry and see if there were lines of continuity with African puppetry or object performance. And we very quickly hit a brick wall because there are no examples in the material culture that we know of performing objects that were made by enslaved people. So there's a gap of several hundred years there. And in trying to find those lines of continuity, I had to stretch the definition of puppetry and look at the entire performance context in which Africans were animating objects in performance. So out of that, I came to things like church fans, people who say landed on the sea islands off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina. They found the same hot, humid climate they were used to in Africa. They also found the kinds of plant life that were similar, and they applied their weaving skills to making things like fans. Some of those fans had a ritual meaning in their culture. So that kind of continued in a sort of underground way until the late 19th century, when we start having cheap lithography, so cheap ways of reproducing color images. And one of the places that those images would turn up is on paper fans, often used in churches. So Black churches start to, instead of having the original fans that were woven from plant fibers, they started to use these paper fans, often donated by Black-owned businesses like the local barbershop, beauty parlor, funeral parlor. And on one side, those fans would have images of people, usually civil rights heroes like Dr. King or famous gospel singers like Mahalia Jackson. So if you've been in a service in one of those old churches where it's hot and sticky, not just because of the weather, but because the service is moving people, you will see the fans moving in a kind of liturgical choreography. Mm-hmm. If, for example, we're holding up a Mahalia Jackson fan and the choir is singing a Mahalia Jackson song, that's almost like animating Mahalia Jackson.
Right.
And then underneath that, fans had ritual meanings in Africa. In some societies, for example, they were used to pass blessings. And if we look at the way that fans are used in Black church services, for example, to cool things down, which is another ritual meaning. If they have people, they get the spirit, they fall out, they're shouting, and the ushers have to come and attend them. Very often they're fanned. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a line of continuity I would find. And so that's how I drag church fans into the category of performing objects.
And then what about some examples of like instruments? We've spoken about that before.
So many West African languages are tonal languages, which means that the pitch of the sound that you pronounce has meaning. So if I could say the syllable ba, I could say it high, ba, or low, ba, or rising, ba, or falling. And those could mean different things. Ba, ba, ah. Same two phonemes, but they have a different meaning. Mm-hmm. And drum tones could mimic those meanings by, there's a particular type of drum that the drum heads are on strings, and then the body of the drum narrows in the middle. Mm-hmm. So when the drummer is performing it, he or she has the drum under their arm, and they can squeeze the drum in closer to their body, and that will put more or less tension on the drum head. When you hit that drum head, then you can bend the pitches. Mm-hmm. And thereby you can broadcast different tones. So we have what's known as the talking drum. That's one way that African musical instruments have historically vocalized. But African Americans, when they got their hands on other musical instruments, particularly brass instruments in the United States, they often didn't get music lessons. They just got their hands on an instrument and they start playing with it until they can make the sound. So the music that they first tried to play were the songs that they knew as singers. Mm-hmm. Consequently, music critics have long commented on the vocalizing quality that many African American musicians have brought to playing instruments. We make them sound like they're singing or moaning or screaming.
That's right.
So then I put that together with the fact that the traditional Black marching bands, particularly our HBCU marching bands, are incorporating a lot of dance elements and a lot of spectacle elements that we can connect to processions in Africa. Mm-hmm. And where you see that when they are holding their instruments, instead of holding them straight up and pointing, straight forward, they move them side to side, they tilt them up and down, and this is all choreographed. That's part of the rehearsal that the bands go through. And so then we have these instruments that are playing with this kind of vocalizing tone, but they are also animated in that the musicians are dancing the instrument. So the instruments are creating both visual and auditory rhythms, and that was my entree for arguing it, that those instruments are also performing objects.
Mm-hmm. Because you were on a roll, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Okay.
But I did want to ask, up front, you talked about how there was a gap in the historical record.
Yes.
Why was that, or why, to the best of your research or knowledge, was there that gap?
So there's a gap in the material culture record.
The material culture record.
We
right?
just haven't found those puppets that our ancestors may or may not have made.
Oh, they existed. You just have not
Well,
found them.
I'm not going to say that they don't exist, because
Okay.
human beings are endlessly resourceful,
Uh-huh.
but no one has found one yet.
Okay.
Not in the United States. We do have things in Brazil, for example, but in the United States, this is a country that was predominantly settled by Protestants.
Mm-hmm.
And the Protestant churches did not like iconography of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
And they were more likely to see the kinds of statues and masks that Africans made on the continent as heathen idols.
Mm.
So if a group of enslaved people had put their resources together to make a mask or a statue, the slaveholder most likely would have seen that as devil worship.
Right.
So if somebody made one of those and it was discovered, it was going to be destroyed. And if they managed to keep it from being destroyed, the only way it would have survived is by being hidden.
Right.
So there's that. But then there's also the fact that in Africa, those types of objects, there was a whole ritual culture even around making them. So they were usually made by often blacksmiths, but
Mm-hmm.
these people had not just, a skills training, but a training in certain rituals. So if we're going to cut down a tree to carve this mask, we have to go find the right tree because it's a certain species that we need for this particular figure. We have to get the blessing of the tree, which involves certain offerings and prayers before we cut it down. And then the artist kind of has to focus on that as a spiritual devotion during the time that they're making this object. None of that process was available to enslaved people.
Mm-hmm.
People, often didn't even have the right to cut any trees that were on the property where they were enslaved. So where are you going to find a chunk of wood big enough to make it? Where are you going to have the time to do it outside of your other duties? And where will you get the tools?
Right. They're not going to give you sharp tools.
No. And you don't have the appropriate priest and other people to bless the process.
Mm.
So that's also part of why we don't have those objects.
There's always hope.
Yeah, like I said, people are endlessly resourceful, and
Yes, they are.
over several hundred years, probably in some time in some place, somebody did manage to make something, but it just hadn't surfaced yet.
Right. Why do you think object performance has played such an important role in Black American culture?
So in my previous answer, I was laying out for you the logistical material culture challenges of making the kinds of performing objects that people had known on the continent. Now I'm going to talk about the social challenges.
Mm-hmm.
So those performing objects in the African context were usually made for important community building rituals. So there would be a mask society that raises the money to commission the mask.
Mm-hmm.
They would also train the dancers who were going to perform the mask. And that would be, little kids would start maybe at 10 and they might be in their teens before they're old enough to perform that mask dance.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a society in their community that handles that training. They pay the musicians on the day of the festival. And the musicians also have their own training system involving other people in the community. Then when these festivals would occur, it's in the public space, and everyone in that community, but also from surrounding communities, will come And Africans had a concept of hospitality, so we can't just invite people to our festival and not feed them.
Mm-hmm.
So there would be communal efforts to raise money to either purchase whatever food they were going to serve or to go hunting and find and dress the meat, or to have in-kind donations. And all of those social networks are what was destroyed in the process of the Middle Passage and slavery. And here I have to add that the skill and the networking ties that are required to organize an activity like that, a festival, are the same skills and networking systems that you would need to organize a revolt. Yes?
Yes.
and, so, and so that's another reason that slaveholders did not want people reproducing those kinds of rituals in the Americas, because if they had the ability to put on something like that, they would also have the ability to organize a revolt.
Right. In your research, how have you found that ideas of object performance spread among Black folks here, both formally and informally?
I think we can't really talk about object performance until the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
But I looked in my book at this whole social context in which these types of performances had existed, and people were able to continue elements of that performance context just without the objects, without the material culture.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the important things, and there's been a lot of scholarship recently, a gentleman, Jerome de Wolf, who fortunately reads Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish and French, I think. So he can get in the archives and look at what all of the European colonial powers said
Mm-hmm.
about the slave trade and the colonies that they were establishing in the Americas. He's been able to document that when the Portuguese came into the region, what is now the Congo, in the late 15th century, the Kongo king embraced them because they have all this, wonderful new technology that we want to learn about. And along with that, they were willing to allow Catholic missionaries to come in and open schools. Mm. So they wanted people to get access to the knowledge. They also understood that people couldn't overnight change their belief system to embrace this foreign religion. Mm-hmm. So they developed a form of Catholicism that was compatible with their existing spiritual practices. And one of the things that fit well was in Portuguese and Spanish Catholicism, there were these traditions of brotherhoods, like a brotherhood of the rosary, mm-hmm. or a brotherhood of this saint or that saint. And there would be saints' days, and these brotherhoods would have processions of the saints in the streets on that day. So the Kongo Africans, they formed these kinds of brotherhoods, and they adopted these processions and blended them with African cultural practices. And to really compress de Wolf's research and other researchers working in this field, those brotherhoods, because the Kongo people were the first ones transported and resettled in the Americas, they're called the charter generation. And so they reestablished societies that were like those brotherhoods, often under the guise of serving whatever Catholic saint it was. Mm-hmm. But other important functions of these brotherhoods were mutual aid societies. So if somebody's sick, the brotherhood will help take care of you. When someone dies, the brotherhood will have a procession and a funeral so that you are laid to rest with honor and dignity. Mm-hmm. And then those things become like the social aid and pleasure clubs that we see in New Orleans down to present day. that, second line at funerals.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So, like, let's look later. Let's say, like, post, 19th century, 20th century and later.
Okay.
Do you have anything in the record that talks about people formally passing along ideas of object performance, or is it all informal?
Formally. Formally.
Books.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So if I move up to the 1930s and the Federal Theater Project, which was part of the Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression, they had puppet troupes that presented shows all over the United States. One of the other deterrents for African Americans encountering puppetry prior to this early 20th century is, of course, segregation. Are we allowed in that theater? And if we are allowed in that theater, do we want to see the show? Because there were an awful lot of blackface puppets.
Right.
Do we want to pay money to see that?
Right.
Not necessarily. Okay. Yeah. But during the Depression, there were marionette shows going around and, things like fairy tales that might be even at a school that's predominantly for Black children. So that's some of the first places that Black people really got to see puppet theater. And there was a troupe of Black puppeteers who were part of a Federal Theater Project marionette group in Buffalo, New York. They were originally brought in to sing spirituals as part of an Uncle Tom's Cabin show. But then they were trained to operate the puppets. So we have Black puppeteers from that era. We have segregation, and then we have the fact that human beings will congregate with people that they have shared interests with, regardless of their racial, ethnic background. So some people were able to learn about puppetry because they had friends who were doing it, like white friends. And one of the figures that I profile in my book is a man named John W. Cooper, who was a ventriloquist. And he was friends with magicians. The ventriloquists and magicians often work together because both art forms are about illusion. So through those networks, he was able to develop great skill as a ventriloquist. And even though he started his career performing in minstrel troupes, but he never performed in blackface. He performed with his puppets, his ventriloquist puppets.
What are some of your favorite modern examples of Black puppetry in the mainstream?
So are we talking about mainstream like pop culture or mainstream like puppet theater?
I would say, let's say pop culture.
Okay, pop culture. Well, then, of course, we go to the Muppets and Sesame Street. Probably our, most famous pioneer is Kevin Clash, who was a Henson puppeteer. He originated the Elmo character on Sesame Street, but he also worked on other Henson productions like The Dark Crystal.
Yeah.
In that lineage, we also have Chris Hayes, who took over Hoots the Owl after Kevin Clash developed that character. And we have Megan Pfeiffer's Peace, who is the first Black female puppeteer to perform on Sesame Street. Oh, and I should give a shout out to Brad Brewer and the Crotations, who developed their audience by showing up every weekend to perform in Central Park in New York City. And eventually they got into a Coca-Cola commercial. They did television appearances. They did stage appearances. So that's, moving into the 1980s.
Yeah. So we talked some about Black pop culture or pop culture in general. What about the Black puppetry world? So puppet theaters, how has that scene developed in, I want to say the modern era, but I would say mid 20th century on?
Mid 20th century on. Okay. Of course, television has been the big boost for African American puppeteers, because really outside of the Federal Theater Project marionettes, if you were lucky enough to live in a place where some of those came through, Black people still didn't have much opportunity to see puppetry until it started showing up on television.
Mm-hmm.
And then also as schools desegregated and people had a wider range of choices to go to college,
Mm-hmm.
people encountered puppetry in theater programs in universities. So the generations of African American puppeteers who have come along since, the 1970s or 80s, that's how they have entered into the realm. People who are the Living Objects exhibit, which we mounted in 2018 and 19, it opened in October 2018, and I think it came down in March of 2019. That was really a seminal moment because we gathered together all of these people who all across the country were doing puppetry, but they thought that they were the only one. That's, the classic Black nerd scenario. I'm the only one that's doing this. I love it, so I'm going to keep doing it. But boy, it's lonely over here.
Yeah.
So that exhibit brought a number of people together. And since then, we've had all kinds of breakthroughs, like, as I said, Megan Pifus becoming the first Black female puppeteer perform on Sesame Street. We have Edna Bland, who is a expert in puppet ministry.
Mm-hmm.
But she went on to become, this past year, the interim president of the Puppeteers of America.
Mm.
And we have Tarish Jagetto Pipkins, who currently lives in North Carolina. A lot of people probably saw some of his work in the Where They From video with Pharrell and, oh shoot, now I'm going to forget the other performer's name. Sorry, my deepest apologies for not remembering the name because the artistry is awesome. But yeah, when you ask about what were people dancing to in the club when you were going out, I'm a little bit older than that. So.
And what about in the social media era? How has technology and social media, I guess, affected or changed how folks are able to express themselves and share not just Black puppetry, but Black object performance in general?
Okay, good. So one of the challenges that African American puppeteers are still dealing with is that it costs money to produce live theater.
Mm-hmm.
To mount a show entering is probably going to be about $20,000. Mm-hmm. And then it can go up from there. So it's difficult for people to raise that kind of money. Mm-hmm. And it's also difficult, lots of people start in the arts, I'll move to New York and I'll live with 6 roommates and I'll wait tables. And, my 5 buddies that also have the same dream, whenever we're not working, we'll get together and we'll build something together. Mm-hmm. And I think that's harder for African Americans because we usually don't have the resources even to live in New York with 5 roommates. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. People have crushing burden of student loan debt. They don't have parents who can underwrite rent or other expenses for a period of years, or not even years, but months, while they're trying to find their feet. So the advent of social media is a great boon because you can turn on your cell phone camera, hold up your puppet, and start making content and reaching audiences. Mm-hmm. And we have people doing that. About 10 or 15 years ago, there was a gentleman in Philadelphia working in a vein of what we kind of call hood puppets. Mm-hmm. And his character was called Peanut. So Peanut is deeply embedded in Philly hip hop culture. So you can kind of imagine the kind of things that he says and does.
Yes.
And I never did discover the gentleman's name. I think that at one point he had to stop posting for a minute because I think he had some legal issues that he was dealing with. Mm-hmm. But he was really dedicated in posting his content regularly, and not just like 5-minute TikTok clips, but like half-hour shows. Like there was Peanut Christmas special. Mm-hmm. And he had just made up his mind that no one was ever going to greenlight a television show for him So he would just make his own.
Yeah. What current projects are you working on?
So right now I am assisting the Atlanta Puppetry Guild with an exhibit of puppets that we're mounting in an art gallery called ArtStation in Stone Mountain, Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And the exhibit is called Materials in Play. We are calling attention to puppets as visual art objects,
Mm-hmm.
but we also hope that the audience will enjoy looking at the many different kinds of materials that people use to make puppets.
All right. Now we get to the series of questions I ask every guest.
Yes.
The first one.
Mm-hmm.
You alluded to it earlier.
Yeah.
What songs got people on the dance floor when you were going out dancing at your peak? And what songs still get them on a dance floor?
Okay. So I came up with 3 from my peak, all from the very early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
A Deeper Love by Cliviles and Cole.
Mm-hmm.
Gypsy Woman by Crystal Waters. La da dee,
Yeah.
la da da. Yeah. And Vogue by Madonna.
Yeah. All great ones.
Yeah. And what about now? Well, I don't get out. I don't get out much anymore, so I don't know.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've enjoyed listening and moving to a lot in the last year or so is Boots on the Ground,
Mm-hmm.
which is full of African American object performance.
Yeah.
And is definitely in this processional tradition that I've been talking about that goes back to the Kongo.
Yeah. Second question.
Mm-hmm.
What is a Black cultural work that's an absolute classic but is underappreciated? Any genre, any medium.
Okay, I had to think long and hard about this one, but
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to honor my mentor, Kalamu Salam,
Mm-hmm.
who's a writer based in New Orleans and the founder of the Nomo Literary Society and the Neo Griot Crew, which was a video collective.
Mm.
So I wanted to highlight a video that we made in 2003 before Katrina.
Mm-hmm.
It's called He's on His Way, a second line for Norman Dixon Sr.
Mm-hmm.
And what we did was we had 4 cameras on the ground and we captured the last major jazz funeral before Katrina hit. Norman Dixon Sr., he persuaded the New Orleans Jazz Festival to include second line dancers.
Mm-hmm.
And so that became a reliable source of income for some of those groups year after year because they would be invited to perform at Jazz Fest. And he also secured funds for them to be able to get parade permits. So they deeply appreciated him. And when he passed, the funeral procession was so large that the police had to split it down 2 different streets.
Mm.
We captured hours of footage from that, and then Kalamu distilled it into a half-hour documentary, which is on YouTube.
Yeah. And then finally,
Mm-hmm.
what particular dish did you look forward to most when you were growing up?
Yeah, so we had a conversation about soul food, and I did not like soul food because I didn't like those family dinners. Many of them were very tense.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also an opportunity to come up with a positive memory. And I did find one. This is about Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
My mother really loved Christmas, and she worked very hard to make the Christmas season special. So one of her Christmas rituals was making fruitcake. In those days, nuts mostly came in their shells.
Mm-hmm.
So she would get us to help crack the English walnuts and the almonds. Almonds are really hard. Filberts are really hard. And pecans. And we tried to be extra careful with the pecans so they would come out whole. And then she would use the best looking pecan halves to decorate the tops of the fruitcakes.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Paulette Richards, thank you so much for joining me. Where can folks find you?
On my website, I think I've sent you the link.
Yep.
Yeah, so you can put that in the show notes.
Great.
Yeah, that's why we have a website.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you speaking to me.
And thank you for all of your questions. They were fun.
Take care.
You too.
I would like to thank my guest again, Dr. Paulette Richards, for a truly eye-opening discussion. You can find her at her website, paulette-richards.com. Her book, again, is Object Performance in the Black Atlantic, the United States. It's a wonderful book. Please check that out. My one real lesson and takeaway from this discussion really centers on just the triumph of the human spirit, and particularly the triumph of the Black social and communal spirit. So Dr. Richards talked about how all of these things, these communal practices that prop up and facilitate object performance from various aspects of the community had been effectively outlawed and cut off once Africans came to America. But those people and us today still find ways to express that impulse, the same impulse that animated masks and staffs and fans find home in African American culture today, because the spirit and impulse of community and resistance cannot be defeated by norms, by law, or by threat. As always, please like, rate, review, subscribe on whatever platform you use to listen. Please visit the website blacketcpod.com. Until next time.